So what are the rules of the road and the skies for CAVs, UAS, and AAM respectively? How do we make sense of these rules and regulations? And what will be our understanding for what comes down the road and up in the air? So we do have Jared Esselman, who's UDOT's Aeronautics Director, moderating this next panel. I will kick it to you, Jared. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Muriel. I appreciate it. And I understand we are the last thing of the day, standing between y'all and the rest of the workday and maybe an early day off. So we will be concise, although we do want to talk about the different regulations, right? What are the rules of the road for connected autonomous vehicles and for urban air mobility? How do we make sense of existing rules and regulations, and are there new ones that need to be created? So we have a couple of experts on our panel. Ron Thaniel is the Vice President, and Ron Thaniel is the Vice President of Public Policy and Legislative Affairs at Intelligent Transportation Society of America. Ron is an urbanist and a mobility technology enthusiast working to ensure that transportation technologies are deployed equitably and sustainably. He is currently the Vice President and has successfully advocated for federal policy on intelligent transportation technologies, including automated, connected, shared, and electrified vehicles. We also have Michael Sheffield. Michael is a transportation engineering consultant who specializes in the connected and automated vehicle industry. He is passionate about leveraging emerging technologies to improve safety and mobility. He drafted Utah's automated vehicle legislation, which was enacted in 2019, and continues to shape the state's automated vehicle legislation. If Michael is not evaluating the impact of connected vehicles, he can be found spending time with his family, working on his ranch, or playing pickleball. You'll have to ask him what that is, because I have no idea. And we have Greg Pecoraro, who is the CEO of the National Association of State Aviation Officials. Greg, in his role, works closely with the NASAO Board of Directors and other state aviation leaders, so really all 50 of my counterparts, to fulfill the organization's mission to represent the interests of the states and the public before federal policymakers. Pecoraro has served as Vice President of Government Affairs for the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association, as Assistant Secretary for Administration at Maryland Department of Transportation, as well as other key leadership positions in public and private sectors. Well, gentlemen, thank you. I will say Jim Herrera from the FAA was not able to join us today. He was called into a meeting with Congress last minute. So Congress does take precedent, and we will excuse him for that. But gentlemen, thank you for joining our panel today and being willing to present to us. Ron, why don't we kick off with you?
Great. First of all, good afternoon, and especially from Washington, D.C. I totally get being called into a meeting with Congress. That happens often. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Give me 1 second to find the PowerPoint. See here. Let's do this because I'm not able to pull up my PowerPoint for some reason. Let me try this one more time. It's not coming up, huh? So
Ron, would you like us to do that for you? We've got.
Great, yes,
okay.
Technology, thanks.
Absolutely. Just give us 1 second.
Sure, take time. All right. As I said, good afternoon from Washington, D.C. It's Great to be with you today. I actually wish I was in Utah. Spent a good deal of my time at Alta in Salt Lake City. I have family out there. Go down to Moab quite a bit as well. As was mentioned, I'm Ron Thaniel. I'm the Vice President for Public Policy and Legislative Affairs with ITS America. I spend a good deal of my time on the Hill. And so it's been a very busy summer from an infrastructure standpoint. So I would love to come back at a later date to talk about an infrastructure bill. Move to the next slide, please. Great. So for folks who may not be familiar with ITS America, we are an association of public and private organizations focused on advancing the research and safe deployment of intelligent transportation technologies. Our core policy areas cover AV, smart infrastructure, VDEX, mobility on demand, emerging technologies such as blockchain, and also, of course, sustainability and resiliency. Our vision is a better future transformed by intelligent mobility, one that is safer, greener, and smarter. Next slide, please. So in front of you is a timeline of recent congressional action on automated vehicles. And I'm going to actually go through this in some detail. So beginning at the far left of your screen, it's very clear from ITS America, highly automated vehicles have enormous potential. I'm sure you've talked about that today, including safety, especially when you add in V2X technology. I know in the prior panel, I heard a conversation around connected vehicle technology. We know that AVs can improve transportation system performance, create more affordable mobility options, including mobility on demand, and of course, improve freight movement. And that technology has many livability and accessibility benefits. When I joined ITS America back in 2016 from New York State, where I oversaw the state's transportation portfolio, primary reason for my move from New York back to Washington was the opportunity to work on AV legislation. Now, I want to remind you that at the time, there was a considerable amount of optimism that Congress could come together on a bipartisan federal regulatory framework for highly automated vehicles. In fact, in 2017, which is to your far left, 115th Congress, I want to remind you that at the time that the House passed the Self-Drive Act and the Energy and Commerce Committee by a 54-0 vote. The full House passed the bill by a voice vote. You don't see that often here in DC. Dozens of Democrats co-sponsored the legislation. And moving a little to your right, you have the Senate, and in 2017 as well, the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation cleared the AV START Act in the fall of 2017. All members of that committee, Democrats and Republicans, voted for the bill. Just quickly summarizing, the bill had three key buckets. The first bucket was preemption. While the bills took a different approach to getting at preemption, they made clear that NHTSA is the only body able to set vehicle safety standards. Second bucket was safety reports. Both bills required developers to submit safety reports, but the US DOT was not allowed to condition testing or deployment. The third bucket was exemptions. Both bills expanded the number of exemptions while maintaining NHTSA's safety and enforcement authority. So outside of the issue of preemption, which was at the time mainly an issue for a few of the big cities and a few states, and they quite frankly all happen to be ITS America members, the bill was on a glide path for passage. March 2018. That date changed the path of that bill. New York Times headline: self-driving Uber car kills pedestrian in Arizona, where robots roam. It went on to say it was believed to be the first pedestrian death associated with self-driving technology. The brakes in Congress were applied. So let's get to the 116th Congress, which began January of 2018. At that point, there was a renewed interest in passing a bipartisan bill, but also a bicameral bill. So the goal was to have the bill introduced in both the House and Senate. The four corners, the House Energy and Commerce Committee and the Senate Commerce, Science and Transportation Committee, worked in a bipartisan manner. They shared drafts with stakeholders in DC, ranging from federal, state, local roles to safety reports, exemptions, cybersecurity, with a target of introducing legislation late winter, early spring of 2020. So we all know that story. Efforts to introduce the bill stopped after COVID-19 slowed Congress's work outside of response and relief legislation. You know, as the 116th Congress came to a close, the list of unresolved issues continued to grow, including arbitration, federal, state, local authority, exemptions, rulemaking, cybersecurity, labor and workforce concerns. New issues, think of George Floyd's death, were added, including equity and climate change. Today at the 117th Congress, you know, it feels as if we're farther away from agreement on a federal regulatory framework for AVs than at any point in the last 5 years. And a clear example of this is an amendment that was planned for the Endless Frontier Act, which became the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act, from Senator John Thune, Republican of South Dakota, which really makes it clear as to where Congress stands today. It would have been a reasonable increase in the maximum number of highly automated vehicles for which a manufacturer is eligible for an exemption. The numbers were based on the 2017 AV START Act. However, it was not offered because it would have failed due to no support from Democrats. On the same panel, the Commerce, Science and Transportation Committee that approved the AV START Act in 2017. One last point before we move to the next slide. The Energy and Commerce Committee failed to consider a bipartisan comprehensive regulatory framework bill that staff had circulated within Washington for weeks. The goal was to introduce the bill in May of this year and attach it to the House T&I Surface Transportation Reauthorization. Now there's hope, and Senator Cantwell, who chairs the Senate Commerce, Science and Transportation Committee, told Senator Thune earlier this summer that there is still a goal to get an AV bill done this year. It's gonna be tough. The closer we get to the midterm elections, anything that is seen as bipartisan will become more difficult. Next slide, please. So, why did bills establishing a federal framework fail? So, the issues from 2017 are still issues of disagreement, particularly federal, state, and local roles, exemptions, and arbitration. We have new issues: climate change, equity, workforce. Those issues are now front and center and have not been debated. And I will note for the audience outside of Washington, you know, there's a question of, is this the bill for these issues? You know, there's a discussion of this bill is designed to put in place a federal framework, empower NHTSA. So that's an issue out there. Lastly, public confidence in the technology has been shaken. ITS America member AAA released a report last year which sums this up. Only 1 in 10 drivers, 12%, would trust riding in a self-driving car. Even more, the report states, Americans, 28%, do not know how they feel about the technology. Similarly, consumers are stuck in neutral on the road to accepting self-driving cars. Now, I want to be very clear. From ITS America's point of view, a federal regulatory framework for highly automated vehicles is a safety issue. We need to empower NHTSA. We need to give NHTSA the resources to ensure highly automated vehicles are deployed safely. We want Congress to come together as quickly as possible to move forward. Next slide, please. So this is my last slide before we get into a discussion that I look forward to. So ITS America, and I think this is probably the consensus among the industry, we are increasingly concerned that AV technology will join the long list of innovations developed here in the United States using our talent, our brain power, but deployed overseas. It's clear to us also that the US DOT's transportation priorities fall under the priorities of the administration, which are COVID-19, climate, racial equity, and the economy. Look no further than the president's infrastructure priorities or the president's budget earlier this year. So we believe that to get this administration's attention on the benefits of AVs, we have to talk about AVs the way they talk about transportation. To achieve this, we first surveyed our diverse membership of the AV Standing Committee, which resulted in a document called the Cross-Industry Automated Vehicle Policy Discussion Report, Infrastructure, Federal Regulatory Framework, and Societal Goals. Includes fascinating member views on issues such as equity, climate, infrastructure, among others. The second was we established a series of task forces. First was equity, led by Neuro and Phoenix Mobility Rising. Infrastructure, led by Texas DOT and Audi. Safety, led by State Farm and Minnesota DOT. And climate, led by GM and Washington State DOT. All the task forces have completed their work and are currently finalizing their policy principles, which we will take to the administration this fall. In a nutshell, we believe that the path forward for AVs here in Washington, I should say the policy path forward in Washington is to showcase the equity, the climate, the safety, the infrastructure benefits associated with highly automated vehicles. We hope that Congress will see these benefits and move forward on a federal framework bill. That's where we stand here in Washington. I wish I had more of an optimistic tone to share with you. The states are doing it across the country, working with the developers, testing this technology. And we at ITS America firmly believe that it's time for Congress to move forward and take up a bipartisan federal AV framework. So with that, I look forward to questions later in this session.
Thank you, Ron. We appreciate that so much. And I was sitting here taking notes, and we will definitely have some questions for you at the end of this. Absolutely. Thank you. Well, let's move on to Michael Sheffield. Michael, are you ready for us?
Yes, thank you.
Yes, sir. Take it away.
Let me see if the screen sharing woes persist for me. And do you see the presentation?
Yes, we see it, Michael.
Great, thank you. I love the title of this presentation, At the Crossroads, and I underlined CAV, Connected and Automated Vehicle. That's what I have expertise in versus the aviation. But we truly are at a crossroads. Ron did a great job of highlighting some of the issues at the federal level, and their responsibility, like you said, NHTSA, is to regulate the safety performance of vehicles and vehicle equipment. They do this largely through the federal motor vehicle safety standards. On the other hand, we have state and local governments, and they take the lead on licensing drivers, establishing rules of the road, formulating policy for liability and insurance. And these are kind of converging right now with automated vehicles. The vehicle performance and the equipment is now the driver. So there's this intersection of the different responsibilities, and it's a challenge to solve that issue. But states have taken several different kinds of general approaches. Some have taken no action. Others have executive orders, yet others have enacted legislation, and a few have a combination of executive order and legislation. This is all in an attempt to deal with and regulate and promote this industry, and to do so safely. But as Ron so eloquently said it, it's challenging without that that federal guidance, without that layer of consistency that can apply to the nation. The issue is these vehicles travel all over the place. They're not restricted to an individual state, so that federal national guidance is needed. In Utah, however, we have had a few different pieces of legislation over the years. In 2016, House Bill 280 was enacted and required state agencies to facilitate and encourage the responsible testing and operation of autonomous vehicle technology. It also required a report to the legislature about current AV issues and recommendations. These reports are commonplace, and many states have done them to help improve the understanding of this new and emerging industry. In 2018, House Bill 371 was circled. It was paused in the middle of the session, and there was a need that was highlighted for greater stakeholder collaboration and improved language to ensure that the bill and the language and the regulation could be something that we could use long term. Over the interim and in between 2018 and 2019, House Bill 101 came about, which increased stakeholder engagement. We had OEMs, AV developers, members of the insurance agencies, numerous legislators. And then from the state DOT, it was a wide group, and we met together several times. As iterations of this bill were created, we considered model legislation from various industry groups. We considered the enacted legislation and other executive orders from other states, all trying to cater towards our Utah-specific objectives, things that we wanted to accomplish here in the state. I'll go through and highlight some of the specifics of what our current AV regulation is in our policy. First, it defines terms related to AVs. This is needed to provide consistency among states to ensure that there's a commonality, there's a common understanding with these vehicles. We allow the remote operation of a vehicle, and this remote operation, it supports the dispatching of AV fleets. If the vehicle ever gets into a spot it needs help with, somebody can help and operate it remotely. And this is in an effort to encourage the deployment and testing of this technology in the state. Third, it allows an automated driving system, or ADS, which we know with the SAE levels is level 3+. So we allow an ADS to operate a motor vehicle without human involvement or monitoring. And essentially, as long as it follows traffic laws, as long as it's compliant with the federal motor vehicle safety standards, unless an exemption is provided, and then the vehicle must be properly titled, registered, and insured. So we intentionally have kind of a hands-off approach, and rather than regulating and saying we want you to what's the word? We want you to come and get a approval to test or approval to deploy. We just say, go ahead and do it. Just follow the laws. Make sure you follow the laws. You're compliant with the standards, and the vehicle is properly titled, registered, and insured. Another thing that our legislation does is that while engaged, it states that the ADS, the software, is responsible for the compliant operation of a vehicle. We believe this is where the industry will head long term, and enables people to use these vehicles that can't normally drive, with the ADS being responsible. 5, we established protocol in case of a crash. Basically, there needs to be a way to provide the required information to the responding peace officer. And 6, the DMV may revoke the registration of the vehicle if the ADS is operating in an unsafe manner, or if the ADS is being engaged in an unsafe manner. And this was needed to provide a mechanism for us to restrict and limit the operation of these vehicles if it posed a safety risk. This is, safety is a primary focus here, and that's one of the things that these vehicles promise to do, is to improve safety. But if not done properly, we wanted the way to be able to restrict their operation. So this concludes my presentation on the AV regulations here in Utah.
Well, thank you, Michael. I appreciate it. I also took some notes and definitely will have some questions for you at the end, especially on some of those state laws. Next, we have Greg Pecoraro, CEO of NASAO. Greg, we're looking forward to it. What can you tell us about aviation in the States?
Well, thanks, Jared. It's great to join you today, and many thanks to both the UDOT and the FHWA for organizing this session. For those not familiar with us, the National Association of State Aviation Officials is one of the most senior aviation organizations in the country. In 1931, as NASAO was founded, aviation was growing rapidly across the nation, and states were taking an active interest in how this new mode of transportation could benefit their communities and how it should be regulated. Most states began creating aeronautics agencies within their governments. Unfortunately, the vast size of the country and limited communications meant that regulations and standards could easily vary from state to state. So the states came together to create an organization to develop nationally accepted aviation standards, but they quickly realized that they themselves weren't really able to enforce these binding national standards. So they encouraged the federal government to get involved, probably one of the few times states have done that, and decided to continue working together themselves to play an active role in advocating for the interests of states and the public. I think we find ourselves in a similar situation today. When you think about combining the concepts for advanced air mobility and unmanned aircraft systems with those in the field of connected and automated vehicles, we have the potential to create a new world within aviation. The prospect of connecting urban, suburban, and rural areas, some of which are not conveniently served by surface transportation or are underserved by existing aviation activities, in a new way that's cleaner and quieter and more efficient, is exciting for everybody. But before this new technology can launch and disrupt existing transportation systems, there are a lot of questions that need to be answered. And I think we've heard a little bit about what some of those could be in the last two presentations and probably earlier in the day. Clearly, it's in everyone's interest to dive into these issues quickly and thoroughly as soon as possible, but safety always has to be the overriding priority. Now, I understand that FAA certification for new aircraft in the AAM and UAS fields, particularly in AAM, is still a few years away, and the FAA's guidance on vertiports has yet to surface publicly. But as we've seen with other emerging technologies, the market won't wait for government. And many knowledgeable people expect that these aircraft will be flying within 5 to 7 years. In fact, right now, almost every week brings another company demonstrating, their aircraft, that are successfully, flying, from point to point. You're probably aware that billions of dollars in investment capital are being poured into these emerging technologies. And some of these companies are already testing operations in other countries and trying to strike deals to begin operations there. So continued US leadership in aviation is threatened if we don't figure out how to move forward as quickly as possible, but also as safely as possible. The process is underway, perhaps too slowly for some, but we're all now engaged in looking at how to plan for and regulate AAM and UAS and CAV technologies at every level of government that's dealing with these issues. As always, we look to the federal policymakers and regulators to take the lead, but there are a lot of questions that will have to be answered at the state and local levels. And that's where agencies like UDOT are going to have to play an important role. In doing so, the aviation community's governing authorities are going to face a broad set of tasks. Among them, we face developing a common set of terms to use in planning documents and regulatory language, rules governing solutions for detect and avoid technologies, criteria for landing and launching facilities at public use airports, identifying common characteristics for setting potential vertiports that are independent of existing airports, integrating AAM with other aviation activities and in the airspace and in the larger transportation network. Managing public access and security for AAM and UAS facilities in aircraft is also critical. And finally, developing and implementing a public awareness and acceptance campaign that will make people comfortable with autonomous travel in the air. States and local governments will need a lot of help figuring this out. Staffs are already underfunded and overburdened by current responsibilities. There's legislation proposed in Congress right now to provide planning grants to state and local governments to assist with managing these costs, and NASAO strongly supports this proposal. It's critical at this juncture that state and local authorities play a larger role in these discussions. As significant funding from the administration's infrastructure program looms ever nearer on the horizon, hopefully within a few weeks, good planning, engineering, and development can enable us to transform many of today's properly located airports into the airports of the future, ready to accommodate these new aircraft and these new ways of flying. While the noise and environmental impact of eVTOL aircraft should be significantly lower than current operations, their presence as certified aircraft at existing public use airports should be easy to integrate without attracting negative public attention. I know a lot of state directors, aviation agencies are wondering how these aircraft's use of the airspace will be managed. They're concerned that adequate thought has not yet been given to this. I'm not an expert on airspace issues by any means, but I understand that some have concerns about how these aircraft will be controlled as they operate at relatively low altitudes, and who's going to manage that. Local communities will take a strong interest in that as well, of course. These concerns are considerable already for pilot-operated aircraft. When the projected shift comes to uncrewed aircraft, the concerns will multiply. Many in the aviation community are concerned that the sense or detect and avoid issue has not been satisfactorily solved. The beyond visual line of sight arc is ongoing right now. We still haven't got the rules quite figured out. It's fair to expect that the general public can be expected to require a lot of persuasion on this issue. I think it's fair to say that there are far more questions than answers at this point on how all of this is going to be regulated and managed. It's great to be partnering, see the partnership between the FAA and NASA and state and local authorities in this effort to try and figure all this out. It's going to take a tremendous effort from all of us to get ready for this. State aviation agencies like Jared's are focused on this effort as an important element of the future of our industry. And we as an organization are deeply engaged as well. And we're looking forward to working with all of you as we try to figure this out. I'm looking forward to continuing this discussion with the others on the panel. And I think we're going to be talking about this for quite a while.
Thank you, Greg. Yes, we will be talking about this for quite a while. I've got a couple questions for each of you, and really all three of you touched on some aspect of each of these questions. Ron, you talked about some of the bills that saw some success and some failures. But success and failure aside, what are the key elements of autonomous vehicle bills, both for surface transportation and aerial mobility, that have been introduced, and what are the key elements that need to be introduced?
Sure. That's a great question. So, as I pointed out, the key elements range from federal, state, local authority. What is the role of the federal government, which is, we would say, design, construction, and performance of an automated vehicle. State, local is the operational authority of that vehicle on public roads. That's an outstanding question that continues to be debated. Oftentimes the debate is centered on actions of the vehicle that today are done by the human and under state and local authority. The other issue is dealing with exemptions. What is the reasonable increase in the number and duration of exemptions. Right now, an automaker can receive up to 2,500 exemptions for a vehicle not in compliance with FMVSS. And so what the bills have done is they have increased the number of exemptions somewhere in the range of about 25,000 in the first year, and topping out at somewhere in about 100,000 after 3 to 4 years. And there's a question of how many exemptions should be allowed. We believe that you got to do exemptions. You have to test the vehicles. You got to make sure they are safe. The other issue that is out there is this issue around safety reports. This quickly will get you to the whole conversation around pre-market certification, type certification that you see in Europe. Right now, the way it happens here in the US, as it has been for more than 50 years, automakers will certify that the vehicle is safe. NHTSA has this enforcement authority to pull the vehicle off the road if it's not safe. There are some that have suggested that there should be some kind of pre-market certification where before a vehicle is put on the road, the DOT, NHTSA, the secretary will assess and will state that the vehicle is safe for road use. That's a massive departure from the self-certification model that we have in the US, and some in the industry have said that will set back deployment of AV technology for years as the DOT tries to put in place a pre-market certification model. The fourth area, which I'm not going to get into because it's very controversial, we don't have policy on it, is arbitration around AVs. And so I'm going to stop there on that issue. You know, the issues that have not been debated, and as I pointed out, you know, there's I think a valid question of if these issues fall within a bill simply designed to give NHTSA the authority to regulate highly automated vehicles. And those issues, for example, equity. And after, you know, George Floyd last summer, that issue is front and center. The position that as AVs are deployed, in particular in the TNC model, that they should serve all communities. And I think that issue is going to be, you know, worked through. You get issues of the unbanked population around that. It's a tough one. You quickly get into issues of transit and AVs. But again, I'm going to point out, and I know it's a raging debate here in Washington, should issues of equity, climate, zero emission vehicles, should these vehicles be deployed as zero emission vehicles? Now, you should know, within our cross-sector report, we looked at both equity and climate. And our members believe that to get to equity, you have to deploy these vehicles in a TNC model and not personal ownership model. It's going to take much longer to get to the equity goals with personal ownership. That said, that's not policy right now. On climate, our members also firmly believe that that's where the industry is going. So there is no need for a federal mandate that these vehicles should be zero emission vehicles. But those are examples of the two issues, workforce labor issues. Those issues have not been debated. And again, I want to point out, there's a question of should those issues be part of a federal regulatory framework bill? So those are some issues.
Thank you, Ron. And I'm gonna take kind of a little bit of what you started with, and I'm gonna toss it right over to Greg, because Ron, you started with the authority, right? The federal government has certainly some authority, and then the states have a very clearly delineated authority on the roads. That is not the case in the air. And so, Greg, I'm going to toss that to you to talk a little bit, because you actually asked the question, who manages control of those low altitude autonomous aircraft? So I'm going to kind of toss that over to you to play off of Ron.
That's a great point, Jared. And it's, you know, as you said, I alluded to it, you know, when we talk about aviation, you know, one of the things that, of course, we realized early on in the days of aviation is that just by its nature, aviation is so mobile that it's not really, you know, an industry or a mode of transportation that respects boundaries very easily. So a patchwork of regulations across the country was never going to work, you know, for managing the aviation system. And that's why the federal government had to step in using the Commerce Clause. But here we are now, we're talking about a very different kind of aviation. We're talking about very local point-to-point aviation going, from, when we talk about, eVTOL type aircrafts, and, in AAM, a lot of that is, when we think about urban air mobility, suburb, to downtown, local point-to-point transportation, low-level flying aircraft. It's going to be difficult for the FAA to manage all of this. And the FAA has indicated that they perhaps may not want to manage, air traffic control at that level for these aircraft. So, there are going to have to be some rules of the road, so to speak, in the airways on how we're going to manage this. And is this going to be something that the feds are going to set, or that the state and local governments are going to set? And these are some questions that we're really going to have to wrestle with in the next couple of years before we start allowing this type of activity.
Thanks. Perfect. That's great. So that actually leads me into one of my next questions as we talk about, and Ron, you had mentioned workforce and climate and a couple different issues. We talk about regulating the vehicles. What about the infrastructure? What about regulating the infrastructure? What regulation needs to happen there? And Michael, maybe you've worked on that in some of your legislative efforts. But not only the infrastructure components, but what are the minimum standards that we need to see come about through regulation? And are there, for the road, what are the minimum standards for that? And then for like vertiports, are there minimum structural designs that we need to start considering?
An important element of this is that agencies, whether federal or state, need to be flexible, and they need to be able to move quickly and respond. This industry is moving so fast. What one day, and next thing you know, things have changed, and there's things have kind of turned upside down. It's different, and we need to be able to be flexible as we adapt to these technologies, and that makes regulating them hard because they change so often, because it's still emerging. It's hard to appropriately regulate what is not prevalent and what is still being defined. And at both the state and federal level, I think that's a big challenge. With the infrastructure side of things, a lot of the AV developers are telling the states, just keep building your roads, make sure they're well maintained, make sure the striping is good. And with a high quality infrastructure and that's well maintained, that's what they're building around, is relying on that. And from a state perspective, that we need to have that anyways, not just for AVs, but for human drivers as well. We need to have our roads well maintained and good infrastructure.
Jared, if I could, let me jump in and add something to that. That is that, when you think about the infrastructure question, around the aviation side of this, as we think about these new aircraft that are being developed, there's dozens of different concepts that are out there right now. There's certainly no standardization right now. And when you think about building at an existing airport, or if you're going to build a new vertiport or something like that, or a landing site, on a rooftop, garage rooftop in an urban setting where you're going to land these things, connections to the electrical grid are going to be, of paramount importance. And so we're going to need to make sure, first of all, that the grid can do this. Secondly, that we're able to meet the power demands that these folks are going to need. And finally, what's the standardization going to be, for connecting to the grid? You can't have 20 different aircraft with 20 different kinds of connectors that you need to plug in. I mean, years ago, somebody figured out that whether it's a toaster or a refrigerator or a hair dryer or a radio, they all needed to plug into the wall the same way. And we need to figure that out for aircraft as well, as they're going to, we're going to use, electric aircraft, because, airports, I don't care, what type of landing facility it's going to be, they're not going to be able to, accommodate, a wide variety of ways of doing that. So we're going to have to develop some standardization there. as well as in a lot of other things. And these are the kind of issues that need to be resolved very quickly if we're going to figure this out.
Jared, if I could jump in as well on
Sure,
this,
please.
because I think the question on infrastructure is very timely. As you know, we are debating an infrastructure bill here in Washington. And at ITS America last winter and spring, we actually pulled together a task force of members to determine if we should support the position calling for a dedicated automated vehicle infrastructure proposal as part of the reauthorization of the FAST Act. And our members came down with a very clear position: no. Number one, the automakers are not building vehicles just to operate on infrastructure that has been designed for AVs. They are planning to operate AVs across the country, in rural communities and urban communities. As Michael said, what they are looking for is well-maintained roadway. Fix it first is the overarching priority. They also, it's interesting, and I think Congress is still a little behind on this notion. The definition of infrastructure should go beyond roads and bridges to include communications infrastructure. So when they think of automated vehicles, it's 5G, it's ITS, it's that kind of infrastructure. It's V2X, which I think we may get into in a second. It's that kind of infrastructure that will allow AVs to be successful in the long run. We think it's really important that an AV is able to talk to the infrastructure, able to talk to the pedestrian. And that gets into V2X technology that we believe should be available for AVs. But, I think the bottom line, and it's what I know the president is trying to do, I know it's what the Senate, bipartisan members try to do as well. That is, we got to start with just fixing our infrastructure. You fix it, it's going to be good for the human driver. It's going to be good for the AV as well.
You brought up the infrastructure bill, and there's a price tag to that. So Greg mentioned standards. You've mentioned the infrastructure bill. Michael's talking about the state level and what goes into the infrastructure as we maintain it. So then my question is, who pays for this? As we set standards and as we set rules and regulations, not only on the vehicles, but on the infrastructure, and standardize that infrastructure, who pays for a vertiport in the middle of town? Usually, for the airspace side, which is what I'm more familiar with, the AIP fund pays for improvements at airports, and the highway fund pays for improvements on the road. Neither of those really meet this. The highway fund may be more appropriate for autonomous vehicles, but who pays for what we've got here, or who pays for what we need?
Yeah, that's a great question. On the aviation side, I think one of the things we need to look at first is this incredible network of public use airports that the federal government and the American people have been paying for, for decades now. Before we start building a lot of vertiports, which I think is going to be challenging anyway, to sort of get local communities say, sure, build one right here in our neighborhood. I think people are a little more optimistic about the chances of getting those done quickly and easily than I am. But we've got public use airports situated pretty conveniently all around the country. And these are a great place to start when we start talking about the use of these aircraft. And then as the need, of course, in urban areas, you're going to need to develop some landing pads and launch liftoff sites in cities, and there's going to be on rooftops or other flat places like that. But in the suburbs, the exurbs, in rural areas, we've got this network that's out there already, and I think that's the first place to start to make this work.
On the AV infrastructure question, I agree with Greg. It's a good question. From our standpoint, it's the existing surface transportation program. Right? The question is, what supports the existing surface transportation program right now? It's gas taxes. It's not sustainable. We believe you have to move towards a VMT, where we capture electric vehicles, for example. But what we do today for the human driver will benefit the AV. And the way we build a road today is not the way we built the road in the 1950s. I always look at the Tappan Zee Bridge, formerly known as the Tappan Zee Bridge in New York. Now that bridge was an old bridge. The new one, across the Hudson River, is loaded with sensors. You know if there's a problem with the bridge. And so I looked at that example and applied that to the roads today. We want wider striping, we want digital signage. And so again, not only is that good for the AV in the future, it's good for the human driver today. So we don't believe there needs to be some kind of new separate funding source for infrastructure that would support AVs. And in fact, you should know that in 2019, we looked at the current surface transportation program eligibilities, and we determined that there's no new eligibility needed for AV infrastructure. Everything that you need to do today, digital signage, better lighting, wider striping, or that physical infrastructure as well, you can do now. So, we got to figure out how we're going to pay for infrastructure, period. I think that's the bigger question. But there's nothing special needed for AV infrastructure from our standpoint.
Michael, anything you'd like to add?
I think Ron said it perfectly. I'll just echo that.
Okay.
and agree.
Okay. So here's my last scenario for you, and then we'll turn some time back over to Muriel to close us off. If you were sitting down face to face with a lawmaker today, what advice would you give them to help them draft legislation to embrace, empower, and enable autonomous vehicles, whether in the air or on the surface? What advice would you give them today if you were sitting with them face to face?
I'm gonna start with Michael. If you could go first, you guys have had more success at the state level than we've had in Washington. So,
I would just say to take a step, to try something. There's no doubt that the legislation we passed will be changed in years to come. There's no question about that. But in the midst of this changing industry, we took a step. We looked at the principles that we wanted to have. We wanted to improve safety. We wanted to encourage deployment. And with the knowledge that we have at this point, we took that step to move towards encouraging the deployment of these technologies. So take that step.
So
And I think, so go ahead, Ron.
Okay, I agree. When I talk to members of Congress on AV legislation, I start with one word: safety. And I think that we have nearly 40,000 lives lost on our roadways right now, every year, and that's just too many. We have a technology that can reduce around 90%. And if we tie it to AVs and other types of intelligent transportation technologies, you're going to see even less fatalities. So while we want climate and while we want equity, and these are very important issues, this first bill should empower NHTSA so that NHTSA has the resources and the regulatory authority to oversee highly automated vehicles. Let's get that in place. A 50 state patchwork is not the way we should be doing this. And then we go and we look at these other issues, which I think are very important issues, but we need to get the safety piece in first.
And on the aviation side, as we look at it from that perspective, Jared, I would say, first of all, that something we need to keep in mind is that, the US leadership in aviation is at risk. We need to make sure that the United States stays in the forefront of these emerging technologies. And the way to do that is for Congress to do two things. One is to tell the FAA that they need to get these things figured out by some date that makes sense for everybody. Pick a date and say, we want to see this done. But the second part of that needs to be to give the FAA the resources to get it done. I mean, they're certainly got lots on their plate right now. They're going to need more people. They're going to need a little more bandwidth in order to get this done in the time frame that it needs to happen. But we can't wait years and years for the first of these aircraft to be certified. We can't wait years for the standards for vertiports to be published. We need to figure these things out quickly. There needs to be an all-out press to do it, and that means that the FAA is going to need to be able to, devote, the human resources and the financial resources to getting it done quickly, so that that the American market can keep up with the rest of the world on this.
Fantastic, fantastic. Thank you, gentlemen. And I would echo that right with you, Greg. We've been told so many times, and Michael is right on, take that step, right? You have to make that investment. You don't get a return on investment if you never make the investment. Go ahead and take that step. Well, Greg, Ron, Michael, thank you so much. This has been a great panel. If anybody has further questions for Greg, Michael, and Ron, please look up their associations. We've got them listed on the agenda, and you can certainly look them up. I know I'll just put a plug in for you, Greg. You're the CEO of NASAO. You can go to NASAO's website. You can find Greg easily enough that way. We will turn some time back over to Muriel to close us off, and then we'll give everybody their day back.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. You bring so much expertise to this discussion, and regulations and policy are so vitally critical to the success of these technologies.